February 1981. Clarence House, London. A 19-year-old woman had just moved into the residence of the Queen Mother, newly engaged to the Prince of Wales, her face on the front of every newspaper in the country. On her bed, waiting for her, she found a handwritten note. It was from Camilla Parker Bowles, 33 years old, the wife of a cavalry officer, a woman almost 14 years her senior, inviting the new fiancée to lunch. Diana Spencer would say later, on tapes recorded secretly at Kensington Palace in 1991 and used by royal biographer Andrew Morton, that she read that note and understood in one cold instant that her marriage had begun with somebody already inside it. The wording, as she recalled it to Morton, "Such exciting news about the engagement. Do let's have lunch soon when the Prince of Wales goes to Australia and New Zealand. He's going to be away for 3 weeks. I'd love to see the ring. Lots of love, Camilla." That is a single source, Diana's own testimony. The physical letter has never been produced, but the detail lodged in public memory because it had the unmistakable texture of something true. The warmth, the calculation underneath the warmth, the scheduling of access to a man who belonged, in the view of the note's sender, partly to her. The world has spent more than 40 years asking a different question after that moment, and it asked it again, 13 likes deep, in the comments under this channel's prior video on Prince Charles. The question was this: just showed how long Charles was fascinated by Camilla. What was her attraction? Nobody in this record, including Camilla herself, has ever claimed the answer was her looks. What the record actually contains is more specific than that, more legible, and considerably more interesting. This is the answer. Assembled from the documented sources, from Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography of 1994, which drew on more than 10,000 of Charles's private letters and journals, from Penny Junor's The Duchess, the 2017 biography written with acknowledged proximity to the Charles circle, from Diana's Morton tapes and her BBC Panorama interview of November 20th, 1995. One question, the sourced argument, the mythology set aside. Let's begin in 1971. The polo match comes up in almost every account. Charles met Camilla Shand, the story goes, at a match at Smith's Lawn in Windsor Great Park, sometime around 1970. The image is practically cinematic. An aristocratic girl in the summer sunshine, a prince watching from the railings. History Extra, directly summarizing Dimbleby's authorized biography, calls it a legend, a piece of mythology that replaced a more ordinary reality. What both authorized accounts actually document, Dimbleby in 1994 and Penny Junor in 2017, is this. Charles and Camilla were introduced at the London flat of Lucia Santa Cruz, daughter of the Chilean ambassador to Britain, who had been Charles's girlfriend during his Cambridge years. It was a drink at a flat in London. Charles was 22. Camilla Shand was 23, about to turn 24. That discrepancy, polo match versus flat in London, is worth naming because it signals something about how this story gets told. The romantic version travels further than the documented one. This film uses the documented one. They had, by genealogy, a connection that preceded either of them. One of Camilla's maternal great-grandmothers was Alice Keppel, born April 29, 1868, in Woolwich, Kent, married George Keppel in 1891, and from 1898 until King Edward VII's death in 1910, the monarch's long-term mistress. The biographical line runs, Alice Keppel, to her younger daughter Sonia Cubitt, to Sonia's daughter Rosalind, who married Major Bruce Shand, to Camilla Rosemary Shand. Great-grandmother, not great-great-grandmother, a distinction that keeps getting wrong in popular accounts. On Charles's side, Edward VII, to George V, to George VI, to Elizabeth II, to Charles. Making Edward VII Charles's great-great-grandfather. The genealogy is confirmed. There is a line attributed to Camilla at the moment of that introduction. My great-grandmother was the mistress of your great-great-grandfather, So how about it? The phrase has circulated for decades. The earliest traceable published source for it's a 1992 People magazine article. Neither Dimbleby's authorized biography nor Juner's The Duchess reproduces it as a documented quotation. Scholars and biographers treat it as folklore. What Juner's account actually records is that it was Lucia Santa Cruz, not Camilla, who made a joke at the introduction about their genetic antecedents. The line credited to Camilla may be apocryphal. What it captures, even in its uncertain form, is something real. The ease, the irreverence, the willingness to meet a prince not with deference, but with wit. Whatever was actually said at Lucia Santa Cruz's flat in the summer of 1971, within months they were romantically involved. To understand what Camilla supplied, you first need the full picture of what Charles lacked. Camilla Rosemary Shand grew up between the Lanes, the Shand family's 18th century country estate near Plumpton in East Sussex, and a house in South Kensington. Her father was a major turned wine merchant. Her mother came from the aristocratic Cubitt family. She rode ponies at local gymkhanas from childhood, hunted, shot, fished. Giles Brandreth's biography describes her family background as much grander than the Enid Blyton country image usually applied to it. The Shands, without question, belonged to the upper class. The Shands had position and they had help. Help in the house, help in the garden, help with children. They were gentry. She left Queensgate School at 16 with a single O-level and no apparent regret. Juner writes in The Duchess that Camilla wanted no more from life than to be happily married to an upper-class man and live a sociable life in the country with horses, dogs, children. One former classmate described her to Juner as a girl who walked into school without an anxious thought. That phrase, without an anxious thought, carries a precise weight when set against what Dimbleby's authorized biography documents about the young Charles. Dimbleby's book was 620 pages, drawing on more than 10,000 letters, private journals, and diaries Charles had never before made public. The New York Times reviewed it in 1994 as the portrait of the product of a chilly, emotionally repressed childhood, an often absent mother who was preoccupied with her career, and a bullying, judgmental father who wanted his eldest son to grow up to be an aggressive, take charge sort of guy. At Gordonston, the Scottish boarding school Prince Philip had insisted upon, Charles wrote letters home that Dimbleby quoted directly. One reads, "The people in my dormitory are foul. They throw slippers all night long or hit me with pillows. I still wish I could come home." In other letters, he described the school as absolute hell and colditz in kilts. He arrived at Cambridge shy, insecure, and already accustomed to a world that he inhabited at high ceremony, but didn't fully enter at ease. Royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith, researching her biography of Charles, interviewed Rupert Hambro, a man who knew both Charles and Camilla in the early 1970s. Hambro told her something that cuts to the center of the matter. Prince Charles would call, and she would always take his calls. She always listened. The prince was insecure, Hambro said. She boosted his confidence. Penny Juner, in The Duchess, writes that Charles loved the fact that she smiled with her eyes as well as her mouth and laughed at the same silly things as he did, and that she was natural and easy and friendly, not in any way overawed by him, not fawning or sycophantic. That word, overawed, contains the full weight of his life up to that point. Every relationship Charles had was conditioned by the institution's gravity. People deferred, calculated, or maintained a careful distance. Camilla, nearly 14 years older than the woman the institution would eventually select for him, did none of those things. She had been navigating this social world since childhood. She knew the country houses, the hunting fields, the polo circuit, the Berkeley Square parties. She was at home in the world Charles had been raised to inhabit, but never quite entered without effort. Set that against what the palace required in a future Princess of Wales. The documented 1981 checklist is specific. Anglican faith, aristocratic birth, a virginal or unblemished past. UPI reported at the time that Diana's unblemished past had been confirmed by doctors and publicly proclaimed by her uncle. A 1981 Time magazine profile of Diana described her explicitly as a girl without a past. Lord Mountbatten's documented advice to Charles, published in research drawn from the Mountbatten Personal Archive, was to sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as he can before settling down. Then to choose a suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered girl before she has met anyone else she might fall for. Camilla failed every element of that specification. She wasn't sufficiently aristocratic, she wasn't a virgin, and she wasn't young enough to be shaped. Charles's own cousin and godmother, Patricia Knatchbull, said plainly in 2005, "With hindsight, you can say that Charles should have married Camilla when he first had the chance. They were ideally suited, we know that now. But it wasn't possible." She added, "It wouldn't have been possible, not then." The palace had a checklist. Charles had a need. These weren't the same document. The decoding key for what Charles needed arrives, usefully, from somewhere unexpected. Not the Camilla file, the Tryon file. Dale Harper, born January 3, 1948 in Melbourne, Australia, arrived in England in 1969 and within a fortnight had met Anthony Tryon, 3rd Baron Tryon, a close friend of Charles. They married in 1973 and she became Lady Tryon, ran a fashion label from a boutique in Beauchamp Place, Knightsbridge, and became part of Charles's inner circle. Close enough that Diana, Princess of Wales, wore a kanga dress to the Live Aid concert in the mid-1980s. When Lady Tryon died on November 15, 1997, of septicemia, aged 49, The Independent published her obituary. It included the following line attributed to Prince Charles, that Lady Tryon was the only woman who really understands me. The provenance of that attribution requires honesty. The Independent obituary of November 1997 is the earliest clearly documented source. It provides no original context, no letter, no recorded conversation, no specific occasion. Later accounts vary the wording. The only woman who ever understood me, the only person who truly understood him. That instability of phrasing is characteristic of a quote that has been paraphrased rather than cited from a stable text. No published letter, speech, or authorized biography passage has been found in which Charles himself directly produced these words. A 2008 Daily Mail account attributes the remark to royal insiders, second-hand at minimum. What the attribution gives us, even in its uncertain form, is a diagnostic. This is the category of thing Charles expressed about the women close to him. This is what he articulated the absence of. Dimbleby's entire authorized biography builds the same portrait without ever using that phrase. A man searching, through mentors and confidants and a succession of close friendships, for the one thing that titles and position and public ceremony couldn't provide. Lord Mountbatten, assassinated in 1979. Lawrence Vanderpost, the South African writer and explorer who served as Charles's intellectual and spiritual guide through the 1970s and 1980s. Dale Tryon. Each of these relationships, as the authorized record documents, had a common structure. Charles locating in one person the understanding his institutional life withheld. Dimbleby writes of Charles's yearning to have people understand him, a phrase that runs through his authorized portrait in different registers across many chapters. Vanity Fair, citing Juner, describes Camilla as someone who treated Charles like a normal person and was a proper friend who was unafraid to challenge him when he behaved badly or acted selfishly. Palace staff, quoted in Juner's The Duchess, described her effect at a dinner table. She would be sitting there listening to him behave badly, and all she would have to do is look at him, and the whole atmosphere would change. That isn't the description of a mistress. It's the description of the one person in the room not frightened of him. By early 1973, Charles had joined HMS Minerva for a 7-month voyage in the Caribbean. In March, while he was at sea, Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles announced their engagement. They married on July 4, 1973, at the Guards Chapel, Wellington Barracks, London. A Roman Catholic ceremony, approximately 800 guests, described at the time as the society wedding of the year. Royal guests included the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, and Princess Anne. The reception was held at St. James's Palace. Charles sent his regrets from the Minerva. He didn't attend. He later wrote to a friend, per Sally Bedell Smith's account, "I suppose the feeling of emptiness will pass eventually." Andrew Parker Bowles was a Blues and Royals officer who had previously dated Princess Anne and who, throughout his marriage to Camilla, maintained numerous extramarital affairs, a fact documented by multiple biographies. The 1995 divorce statement from the couple described the marriage as having evolved into completely separate lives, with interests that had always tended to follow rather different directions. That characterization came from the participants themselves. The institution, by July 1973, had gotten what it wanted: Charles at sea, Camilla suitably married, the social fabric intact. By every conventional logic, the story should have ended there. The Los Angeles Times, summarizing Dimbleby's biography in 1994, reported, "The Charles-Camilla romance resumed in the late 1970s, according to Dimbleby, and ended only when he became engaged to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981. Sally Bedell Smith's research records that after the December 1974 christening of Camilla and Andrew's son Tom, for whom Charles became godfather, Charles continued to encounter the Parker Bowleses on the polo circuit and in the hunting fields around the Duke of Beaufort's Badminton estate, Camilla's favorite hunting ground. When Lord Mountbatten was assassinated by the Provisional IRA in August 1979, it was to Camilla that Charles turned for consolation. By 1980, a source close to the Parker Bowleses confirmed to biographers that the relationship had been rekindled. That is, the stress test, the constancy argument, was built to pass. In 1973, the institution had deployed its tools: geography, naval posting, the pressure of social expectation, and the relationship survived them. It survived her marriage, survived his engagement, survived 15 years of the most scrutinized royal marriage of the modern era, and survived the full weight of public grief and hostility that followed August 31, 1997. If what Charles found in Camilla had been available elsewhere, from the institution, from his marriage, from the social world the palace had constructed for him, he would have found it elsewhere. The record shows he couldn't. The received version of the triangle presents a clear geometry: Charles and Camilla as co-conspirators, Diana as the innocent party. The record is considerably more complicated than that, and the complication runs through Diana's own testimony. Penny Junor, in The Duchess, written with disclosed proximity to the Charles circle, a slant the reader should account for, records that during the period Charles first began courting Diana in 1980, the two women were on genuinely good terms. Junor documents that Diana visited Camilla and Andrew's Wiltshire home, Bolhide Manor, in the early stages of the relationship. Junor documents that Diana helped with Camilla's children, Tom and Laura, and that Camilla took something of an older sister role on the day Charles and Diana made their public debut as a couple at Ludlow Races, staying by the nervous 19-year-old's side and serving as a reassuring presence in front of the cameras. Camilla was 14 years older than Diana, and closer in age to Diana's elder sister Sarah, whom Charles had also briefly dated. Then came the note on the bed at Clarence House. In her taped testimony to Morton, recorded at Kensington Palace in 1991, smuggled out, and not publicly acknowledged as Diana's own words until after her death, Diana recalled reading the note and understood its subtext immediately: the scheduling of a meeting timed to Charles's absence. She told Morton she left the lunch with a cold feeling she couldn't name. Diana's interpretation, that Camilla was assessing how much she knew and how much of a threat she posed, is her own, made in retrospect from a position of pain. The note itself, warm and apparently welcoming, could be read differently. Over time, Diana's reading proved accurate. The lunch happened. The friendship continued into the engagement. Then Charles sent Camilla a bracelet in the weeks before the wedding at St. Paul's, engraved with the initials G and F, widely understood as standing for Gladys and Fred, the pet names the two had given each other, borrowed from characters in the Goon Show. Diana discovered the bracelet. She described to Morton finding a photograph of Camilla in Charles's diary during the honeymoon aboard the royal yacht Britannia. These are Diana's accounts. She is the primary witness and an interested one. The record should say that plainly. Her testimony to Morton is primary but partial, the testimony of someone building a case while also reporting the truth of her experience. What the record independently corroborates: Camilla was present at the wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral on July 29, 1981. She is documented in photographs from the ceremony. Diana's later account, given on her personal tapes, includes scanning the congregation for Camilla's face as she walked up the aisle. That account derives from Diana's own retrospective testimony, not from independent evidence. But the photograph places Camilla there, and Diana knew it. In November 1989, Diana arrived unannounced at a birthday party for Camilla's sister, Annabelle Elliott, at the home of Lady Annabelle Goldsmith. Andrew Morton records the confrontation from Diana's account. Diana told Camilla directly that she knew what was happening. Camilla reportedly asked what more Diana could want: public adoration? 2 beautiful children? Diana replied, "I want my husband." Morton presents this from Diana's perspective. Juner's account is sympathetic to Camilla. The terrain between them is contested. Both accounts agree on the essential fact. By 1989, the marriage was broken, the relationship had resumed, and Diana knew. By his own account, Charles's marriage had reached the point of irretrievable collapse by 1986. That phrase comes from Charles himself, spoken in the most controlled environment imaginable, to his authorized biographer, in a conversation recorded for an ITV documentary broadcast on June 29, 1994. Charles, the private man, the public role, aired that evening. Jonathan Dimbleby asked Charles whether he had been faithful to Diana during their marriage. Charles said, "Yes, absolutely." Dimbleby pressed. Charles said, "Yes, until it became irretrievably broken down, us both having tried." That wording is documented verbatim across multiple sources. It's the clearest possible statement of the authorized timeline: the marriage first, the resumption of the affair second, and 1986 as the year of return. Dimbleby's biography, published that October and drawing on more than 10,000 private letters and journals, confirmed the same sequence. Charles had given Dimbleby unprecedented access specifically because he wanted a managed version of the record in public before Diana could further define it. That context is itself part of the evidence. This was a man choosing his own authorized channel for disclosure. The 1986 date and the irretrievably broken down framing weren't improvised television moments. They were the sanctioned account. 18 months before that broadcast, in January 1993, and this requires precision about dates, a telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla that had been recorded in 1989 was published in the British press. The tape's provenance, how it was intercepted and by whom it was first circulated, has never been fully established. The content made the front pages under the name Camillagate. What the recording demonstrates, heard against the full timeline now in evidence, isn't primarily the scandal the tabloids foregrounded. It's intimacy of a very particular kind. Private, unhurried, sometimes ridiculous in the way that long familiarity sometimes is, entirely without the guard that both parties maintained in public. Two people who had known each other since 1971, who had managed distance and separation and marriage and public life, talking as though none of that apparatus existed. That is what the tape shows. It deserves one mention and no more. On November 20th, 1995, 14 years after the wedding at St. Paul's, Diana sat in her sitting room at Kensington Palace and gave the BBC journalist Martin Bashir a 54-minute interview that was broadcast on Panorama to an estimated 23 million viewers in the United Kingdom. She said, "Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." A 2021 independent inquiry, led by former Supreme Court Judge Lord John Dyson, found that Bashir had deceived Earl Spencer by showing him forged bank statements in order to gain access to Diana, and that the BBC had covered up this deception. The Dyson report also concluded, critically, that Diana would have given the interview regardless. Her testimony was genuine even if the method of obtaining it wasn't. The interview stands. What she said about Camilla, 3 of us in this marriage, is the triangle's own verdict on itself, delivered by its most credible and most compromised witness at the same time. By the following year, Camilla and Andrew Parker Bowles had already announced their divorce, their joint statement citing completely separate lives. Charles and Diana's divorce was finalized in August 1996. So here is the answer, assembled from the record. 5 exhibits. Exhibit 1. Familiarity that preceded the institution's plans for him. Charles and Camilla Shand were introduced in the summer of 1971, a full decade before the wedding at St. Paul's, 2 years before the palace had identified Diana as a candidate. Whatever the monarchy required of a future Princess of Wales, it had no reach into Lucia Santa Cruz's flat. The relationship predated the plan. Exhibit 2. Social fluency in a world that frightened him. Camilla was 14 years older than Diana. The relevant gap here is between Camilla and the woman the institution selected, not between Camilla and Charles, who was roughly 16 months younger than she was. She had been at ease in the world of country houses, hunting fields, and polo since childhood. Dimbleby's portrait of Charles is the portrait of a man who inhabited that world in ceremony, but not in ease. The boy who rode home from Gordonston, begging to come back, who arrived at Cambridge shy and insecure, who spent his 20s in search of mentor figures to replace the parents who hadn't managed to know him. Camilla knew the world from the inside. She didn't need instructions. Exhibit 3. The understanding he had spent his life begging for. The Independent's 1997 obituary of Lady Tryon reported Charles as having said she was the only woman who really understands me. That phrase, whatever its exact provenance, and the provenance is uncertain, names the category of need across his entire inner life. Dimbleby's authorized portrait builds the same argument across 620 pages without using that phrase. A man constitutionally in search of comprehension, drawn repeatedly to confidants and mentors who could hear him without the institutional filter. Juner documents Camilla's specific version of this. She was someone who would look at him across a dinner table and, without speaking, change the atmosphere. Per palace staff sided in the Duchess. She would be sitting there listening to him behave badly, and all she would have to do is look at him, and the whole atmosphere would change. Exhibit 4. A shared private country life the institution couldn't replicate. The Parker Bowles homes in Wiltshire, the hunting at Badminton, Charles's Highgrove estate in Gloucestershire after he purchased it in 1980, the notes and packages quietly delivered between houses. This was a life built from years of private ease that existed entirely outside the ceremonial apparatus. Vanity Fair, citing Juner's account, puts it plainly. She treated him like a normal person, as she had when they were together, and if ever he behaved badly, or was selfish or thoughtless, she wasn't afraid to tell him so. She was a proper friend. The institution could stage manage almost everything in his life. It couldn't stage manage this. Exhibit 5. Constancy. From 1971 to 2005, 34 years, the relationship survived 2 marriages, 1 assassination, total public hostility, and the sustained institutional preference for it not to exist. What the palace selected for Charles in 1981 lasted 15 years and ended in the most publicly damaging divorce of the modern era. What the palace had failed to prevent in 1971 lasted long enough to become the thing that the Queen finally, in April 2005, had to acknowledge as settled. The institution's 1981 checklist, virginity, youth, innocence, aristocratic but malleable breeding, was a specification for a Princess of Wales. It said nothing about what the Prince of Wales actually needed. That gap between what the institution optimized for and what Charles's documented interior life required isn't incidental. It's the structure of the tragedy. The palace selected for the photograph and got the marriage wrong. On April 9, 2005, postponed by 1 day from April 8th because Pope John Paul II had died the previous week, Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall. A blessing followed at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. Charles was 56. Camilla was 57. They had known each other for 34 years. Upon marriage, Camilla received the title Duchess of Cornwall. She didn't use Princess of Wales, a deliberate decision, a deference to Diana's memory that no protocol required, but that the circumstances made necessary.
At the reception, the Queen, who had not attended the civil ceremony, offered a toast. She said, "My son is home and dry with the woman he loves." Home and dry isn't the language of romance, it's the language of relief. The institution, after decades of attempting to manage what it couldn't manage, had run out of objections. There is a comment under one of this channel's prior videos that received 12 likes and read, "Camilla has been forgiven. Nothing." That commenter isn't wrong about the scale of the feeling. Polls at the time of the 2005 wedding showed persistent opposition in the United Kingdom, concentrated among people who saw the rehabilitation as an erasure of something that had mattered. Diana had called Camilla the Rottweiler. Camilla had reportedly referred to Diana as that ridiculous creature. Accounts in Morton's biography preserve both descriptions, both offered by interested parties, both likely accurate. The grief was real. The anger was real. A film that answers this question honestly can't paper over it. What changed was incremental. After the marriage, Camilla began regular public engagements. She became patron of more than 90 charities. People who met her in person described being surprised by the warmth, the humor, the normality. Kate Moss, the novelist, stood in a queue with Camilla at a party in 2004 and described her as a complete hoot before realizing who she was. Juner told Vanity Fair, "Before she married Charles, no one really knew Camilla. They only knew that Diana had called her a Rottweiler." On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died. Charles became king. Camilla became queen consort. On May 6, 2023, she was crowned at Westminster Abbey. The Dyson report's finding that Bashir used forged documents casts a long shadow over the 1995 Panorama interview that had done so much to define public feeling. Though, as the report also found, Diana's testimony was genuine regardless. The commenter who said, "Camilla has been forgiven nothing," represents a real and documented segment of the record. The coronation also exists. Both things are simultaneously true. The closing argument here isn't a rehabilitation. It's an explanation. The distinction matters. Return then to February 1981. Clarence House.
A 19-year-old with her photograph on every front page in the country, reading a note on her bed from a woman she had considered a friend. Diana read that note and grasped the structure of what she had entered. The world spent the next 4 decades mostly asking the wrong question, asking about the competition between two women, about blame, about beauty, about who had been wronged and by whom. The comment section asked the right question. What was the attraction? The answer was never mysterious. It was invisible in a photograph, which is why it went unasked for so long. What Charles encountered at Lucia Santa Cruz's flat in the summer of 1971, not at a polo match, whatever the legend says, was a woman fluent in the language he had been raised to speak haltingly. She was unintimidated. She was funny. She had known horses and hunting fields and Wiltshire country houses since long before the Prince of Wales had any particular need of her. She came from the same world but moved through it without the fear. She would take his calls. She listened. Dimpleby's biography builds, across 620 pages of Charles's own letters and journals, the portrait of a man who spent his formative years feeling unseen, misunderstood, and afraid. The institution gave him everything it knew how to give: rank, duty, deference, the most ceremonially perfect wedding in modern British history, with 750 million people watching. What it couldn't give him was what Dale Tryon's obituary named by its absence: the understanding. A friend who would look at him from across a table and not be overawed. Someone who would tell him when he was being a fool. Camilla took his calls for 34 years. Across 2 marriages, a naval posting, total public hostility, and every institutional preference for the relationship not to exist, she remained the constant. Not because the institution sanctioned it, in spite of the institution. Charles's own cousin said they were ideally suited. His own authorized biographer documented that the marriage had irretrievably broken down before the resumption. His own television admission named 1986. The math isn't complicated. Something that survives 34 years of that weight isn't an infatuation. It's a need that never found another answer. The verdict was delivered quietly at Windsor Guildhall on April 9, 2005, when the structure finally ran out of things to throw at it. So what was her attraction? Not beauty. No one in this record, Camilla included, has ever made that claim. What Charles saw in 1971 was the one thing his world was engineered never to give him: a woman fluent in the language he had been raised to speak haltingly, who understood him the way he had spent his life asking to be understood, and who asked nothing of the institution and therefore could never be bought off by it. Diana knew it before the wedding. A note on a bed told her. It took the rest of us 50 years and a comment thread to ask the question out loud. The answer was never her looks. It was her ease.